So for those of you trying to understand how essays in AP Lang are graded, it's really just on a collegial level, right? Preparing you for college level writing, but also just to, like, organize your ideas and trying to be as concise and clear as possible here. In this essay, it's my own personal response to this prompt, the Sally Tisdale essay, and just trying to show you how to, like, organize your ideas and trying to, you know, have a better idea as to what to put into your own writing as you go through the entire year. So eventually, we kind of like want to aim for this level of writing from each and one of you. It's not like, again, perfect writing or um, an impossible to reach standard. It's good writing, but again, it's something that you can all kind of strive for as you put more experience in and so forth. So in this case, we'll look at my comments as we go through the entire essay, and then later I'll read this verbatim, which means like word for word, right? And if you don't care to listen to any of that, then later just go ahead and read it on your own, look for your own understanding. But otherwise, this video should take no more than like 10-15 minutes for me to clarify what the expectations are, and again, what writing expectations I have for you. So without further ado, we do abortions here. No, I didn't format it, MLA, get used to it. Okay, so America's torn between two undying stances regarding abortions. On the one hand, pro-life advocates argue that abortions equate murder and that all life is sacred. But on the other spectrum, pro-choice advocates recognize that whatever happens to a woman's body is entirely the woman's choice. Likewise, abortions are sometimes hard realities in the face of contraceptives failing, or worse, rape. And so in this case, my first comment is that it brings readers into the actual topic by contextualizing. We call it a premise. So rather than just jump into an essay, like a writing that you're analyzing, you can do that if you'd like to. A lot of people would prefer doing something called a premise, where it's kind of like, well, let me just kind of talk about the general issues surrounding the topic, or just kind of like just um, bring out a little bit of what I know in relation to this, so I can transition and make relevant what this reading's all about. Because if you just suddenly talk about abortion, it's kind of like, whoa, didn't really ask you for that. It might seem a little bit strong to come into an issue like that. So contextualizing helps us kind of like bring us into the actual text itself rather than just throw it into our face. But again, you can just bring the text in. It's a little bit more concise that way. And for AP Lang's exam, you might want to do that. But for, like, if you have time to write and you have time to write, a more thought out piece, then a premise usually helps serve the purpose of easing your reader into whatever it is, right? So the next part is, Sally Tisdale stands between these two worlds as she works in her abortion clinic, conflicted with the years and number of encounters she's had with women from all different walks of life. In her harrowing essay, We Do Abortions Here, Tisdale recounts her encounters with the many different women who require her services. So in this case, I'm talking a very brief summary as to what Tisdale's work is. I'm not going to like talk too much about all the scenes and so forth that I'll be saving into my body paragraphs, but I want to let my reader know at least what the entire thing includes and the title of it and so forth on, right? So in this case, I'm actually introducing the actual source itself, the work that we're dealing with here. Furthermore, I write, yet with each reading, she doesn't explicitly condemn the abortions, they are simply matter of fact to her now. While readers expect Tisdale to take a side of the pro-life or pro-choice discourse, she instead leaves us sympathetic to the topic and instead convinces us that the issue isn't so black and white. So I'm kind of adding on to my summary of the entire piece, right? If this one was more about like just giving an overview, a holistic overview of the entire reading along with the title, this one kind of gives us a few samples of those specific elements that are included in the reading itself. So it's kind of, I'm layering everything, right? I'm layering it where the first part is going to be my premise, the second part is going to be the actual reading itself, and then later I'm going to add a little bit more information as to the contents of that reading there. And I finally get to my thesis, which is through a juxtaposition of both the encounters she has with women and her own internal monologue, Tisdale creates an emotional discussion for readers to better understand how delicate the choice really is. And we haven't talked about thesis statements. We haven't talked about anything yet, but we haven't talked about thesis statements, and thesis statements are really easy in that there's really just two components. It's what the author's doing and what's their intention. So in this case, if you look at the first part of this thesis statement, through the juxtaposition, which you might know, is when you contrast two things, right? But she's contrasting her experience, her own like internal monologue, with what she has with other women. That's her method. A lot of this reading is really just like what I think versus what I see these women go through. And the second part is, okay, well, that's her method. What is she trying to do with that? What sort of like effect or message or whatever? And so my second part of the thesis includes Tisdale creates an emotional discussion for readers to better understand how delicate the choice really is. So in this case, it's to open discussion. It's for people to realize that there is a discussion. It's not so black and white. It's not like pro-choice, pro-life. It really is, hey, each woman who comes through here has their own story, and we should consider that as we go through the discussion of abortions and so forth. So in this case, is to understand how delicate the choice really is, because there is no like hard and fast answer to this here. So look at the first body paragraph, where I offer a topic sentence that reads something like this. The essay reminds readers that abortions are not exclusive to a particular kind of woman. And so if you think about this topic sentence, I'm basically saying that there are multiple different types of scenarios that come through an abortion clinic. And that's important because Tisdale wants to offer that there's no stereotypical woman who's coming through the clinic. Yes, you have those who are irresponsible and so forth that we demonize, but we also have those who come here based off of circumstance and off of it's life issues that they can't control. So in this case, my entire paragraph is going to deal with like, why does she want to show us these two different walks of lives, right? To kind of like give us different opinions. So as Tisdale explains, women have abortions because they are too old and too young, too poor and too rich, too stupid and too smart. There is no definitive category or stereotype to accurately approach the topic. So Tisdale instead provides us the different women that she works with to help readers understand each unique plight. Of course, there are the women who the society deems irresponsible, young girls who come in characterized by their ignorance of their own bodies, lead us to criticize them. And so check this out. I have this quote here, right? And I don't know why it inverted like this, but it should be this way. But anyways, if you think about this quote, this evidence I'm bringing in here, I'm giving commentary. And I might not be analyzing yet, but I'm definitely making commentary in terms of like why she just decides to bring this idea in here, that like all these different types of women come into the abortion clinic. And so in this case, I'm talking about, the fact that there is no single woman, but there are, of course, those that we think are irresponsible, and that abortion perhaps is kind of like a cheap escape, right? So in this case, I'm transitioning to these young girls that are oftentimes, you know, doing it out of mistakes of their lives. These are the ones Tisdale, quote, cannot imagine them as mothers. I'm using her own quote as my own. So in this case, the more you can do this on your own, the better, where you take little segments of the reading and you kind of like blend it into your own writing here, right? But otherwise, these are the ones Tisdale, quote, cannot imagine them as mothers because their naivety makes her job a necessity. But then there are the women who legitimately need an abortion. In the case of an 18-year-old girl, now stop real quick, check my transition, right? Because on the one hand, there are these girls that Tisdale can imagine as mothers, but then later I'm going to transition to the other type of woman where, well, they have legitimate reasons. They actually need one. I want to give you an example from the reading, the 18-year-old girl, if you remember. So in this case, my sentences also make sure that they are moving from one idea to the other to complement them. So in the case of an 18-year-old girl with a suggested abusive husband, she is already toting 3 children. And as that girl's husband interjects, quote, "'cause if it was a boy, I'd wring her neck," we are challenged with the question, what if she didn't have an abortion? Would she be able to raise a 4th child? Would her husband stay and help? Would it be fair to raise another child in the context of a loveless parent? Tisdale reminds us that each circumstance is unique and cannot be solely judged on either platform. And so I go back to my topic sentence with this, like, final assessment, right? Where it's kind of like, look, I mentioned it before, I'll mention it again, you cannot simply judge an individual under one lens, under one stereotype. And furthermore, you've noticed I asked a bunch of questions here. Now, I'm not usually a big fan of rhetorical questions, but if the questions are good, like specific to the reading, then go for them. But if your questions are broad and they could be asked for any reading, then you want to keep them out. So in this case, my questions are very specific to her, right? Like a 4th child, with a husband stay and so forth. Like they're all very particular to Tisdale's essay. So the next body paragraph, I write, but ironically, Tisdale despises abortions. Okay, contrast, right? Tisdale is someone who works in an abortion clinic. She's become like numb and used to everything, but she despises them, as she confesses towards the end, which I write over here. Towards the end of the essay, she confesses, quote, "I imagine a world where this won't be necessary," indicating that she doesn't see her job as noble or enviable. Much of the writing depicts the gruesome details of abortions, to the, quote, bloody remains, the bleeding tissues, the blood clots, constantly making the connection that something very human is being destroyed in a cold environment. Now check this transition here. I'm transitioning us into imagery because a lot of this piece deals with imagery. A lot of it deals with what Tisdale sees and reports back to us. So in this case, I'm kind of like complementing that with the fact that she despises abortions. She hopes it's not necessary in the future, because she sees this on a daily basis. So there's very logical transition from one idea to the next, and I'm layering my sentences again here. Furthermore, I write, what is perhaps the saddest thought process Tisdale has in the entire piece is how she personifies the fetus in comparison to a fully grown baby. Got another device going on here. She personifies the fetus. As she describes, quote, I know the weight of a baby's head on my shoulder, the whisper of lips on ears, the delicate curve of a fragile spine in my hand. I know how heavy and correct a newborn cradled feels. The creature I watch in secret requires nothing from me but to be left alone, and that is precisely what won't be done. And this is a pretty long quote. I usually advise people to kind of avoid quotes as long as this. If you bring a quote as long as this, you want to make sure you analyze it to its fullest details, or if you really feel like it can't be said without all this information here. You know what? If you want to bring a lot of information in, paraphrase is usually kind of the answer, but just keep that in mind. Long quotes usually not advisable. But I do so anyways because I want to kind of show the juxtaposition between a baby's head on the shoulder to the creature afterwards here. So I feel like both situations are necessary for the imagery here. In the reader's mind, Tisdale recreates through our senses a baby. We are fairly familiar with it and often cherish it. As she begins to kill the embryo, every part of her memory of a child is associated with it. This, quote, creature could have one day grown up to be something beautiful. Those who perform abortions are not heartless killers. The abortion clinic is simply the result of an unfortunate truth for each person who walks through. So in this case, I'm talking about why she would talk about the weight of a baby's head on her shoulder and so forth, in contrast to this creature, right? Because the creature she recognizes could be that baby one day. And so it's really like killing a caterpillar knowing that it's going to be a butterfly one day. And it shows that she's not a heartless abortion clinic person. If anything, she's pretty human, if anything. And so in this case, we want to consider that this piece is super important to really show that abortion clinics are almost like a necessary evil in a world that is pretty prone to random pregnancies and so forth, right? So we want to consider that with the author's choices here. And then finally, my conclusion here. Now, I've read a few of your summer homeworks, and you guys summarize a lot with your conclusions. Kind of like an amateur mistake, because middle school will usually teach you to do that because it's kind of like an easy way to wrap your ideas up. But it's also the wrong way to do it because you're not really offering anything new to your essay here. And this is kind of my conclusion. I keep it pretty short, but I write, it's strange that someone who finds the word damning in your souls to have done so for so long. It is through Tisdale's testimony that the true state of abortions becomes more clear. No one really wants one, but it must remain an option as the lesser of two evils. So it's kind of like I'm adding to the thesis prior, and I'm kind of adding to a concluding idea where it's like, you know what, the dialogue should be there, but we have to consider this, that it has to remain an option regardless, and perhaps we can try to mitigate that option as much as possible here. Perhaps in this portrayal, the argument isn't so much as pro-life or pro-choice, but more so of pro-education. Tisdale, in her exhaustion, criticizes a society too ignorant for its own good, and that what isn't taught or worked on, contraceptives for example, leads to the continuation of such tragedy. So really, this piece isn't really about I'm taking the side of pro-life people or pro-choice people, but more so of like, hey, abortion's a thing. It has to exist because of different circumstances, but let's make sure we can actually have less of these things happening, because every time Tisdale does it, it's a killing of her soul, and it's really a killing of a life in this case, on both maybe a literal level, but also an emotional, spiritual level. So in this case, just keep that in mind for essay requirements. So we haven't really gone over the AP rubrics and so forth. I wrote this with that in mind, but otherwise, just use that as a guide. Use it as a reference for what my expectations are, because for homeworks, this is what I'm asking you to do. This is how I'm going to ask you to analyze readings, and we're doing this on a pretty daily basis. So prepare yourselves. This is my expectation.